there's a real possibility of a war with China, not one confined to Taiwan, but an all-out homeland-to-homeland conflict. Although this kind of war is the most consequential, our current planning and thinking is focused on a regional conflict over Taiwan that would be constrained, as was the Korean War of 1950. Now, as challenging as a war over Taiwan might be, the real threat is a Chinese strategic direct attack on the U.S. homeland. We are not prepared for this kind of war. A strategic war with China may not happen, but the probability is high enough and the consequences so grim that we simply must prepare for it. This is the most dangerous threat from an external power that we have faced since the War of 1812. We cannot afford to be unprepared. This is the first in a series of videos that are designed to explain the problem and what we need to do about it. Remember, peace comes from strength and readiness, not from weakness. The United States has become accustomed to fighting wars with militarily inferior enemies and fighting them over their own territory, either directly from the United States or from reasonably secure nearby bases. Some of those bases, such as in Afghanistan and Iraq, were in the very country we were fighting. That era has come to a halt. For the first time in well over a century, we are facing a country that is roughly equal in power to us, and in some areas, such as hypersonic missiles, actually superior. That country is China. China is a dangerous peer competitor, which may already have the ability to paralyze the United States in hours to days. China has the second largest GDP in the world and may exceed the United States within a decade. By comparison, the US GDP was more than twice that of Germany and Japan before World War II, and was double that of the USSR during the Cold War. GDP, economic power, does not directly equal national power, but enormous military power depends on manpower and on economic power. And China has more of both than any nation we have faced for 2 centuries. Not only is China powerful, but it has an objective that depends on that great power. Xi Jinping has said that by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the communist takeover, China intends to lead the world in terms of composite national strength and international influence. In other words, he intends China to be number one in the world and to displace the United States, which has long been number one. Over the last several decades, China has made unprecedented gains in its economic power, and it has used those gains to build an extraordinary military at an extraordinary pace. China has the world's largest army. It has the world's largest navy. It has modern air power ready to challenge the United States. It has more ICBM launchers than the United States. It has a global hypersonic missile, a space program that has put lethal weapons in space and is driving toward a military base on the moon, a demonstrated cyber and biological warfare capability, and is preparing itself for war by building multiple fallout shelters. One of the world's great books on strategy is Sun Tzu's Art of War. Among the many powerful ideas in this book is the injunction to know your enemy. To that end, the Chinese have assembled and are ruthlessly employing the biggest and most successful espionage program we have ever faced. Military equipment, planes, ships, and tanks are important, but for them to be successful, they must be in the service of a well-developed strategy. The Chinese have a strategy, and they have written about it. They call it unconstrained warfare, war that knows no distinction between what is or is not on the battlefield. Their still revered leader, Mao Zedong, carried the concept of unrestricted warfare into the nuclear realm. I'm not afraid of nuclear war, he said. China has a population of 600 million, as it did when he spoke. Even if half of them are killed, there are still 300 million people left. These are not the words of a nation that can be deterred, as was the Cold War Soviet Union. For their playbook against the United States, the Chinese have thoroughly studied the first Gulf War, Desert Storm, which they have called a war which changed the world and ultimately changed warfare itself. The first Gulf War saw many firsts, but the most consequential was the significant use of strategic parallel attack. Strategic parallel attack consists of bringing multiple essential centers of gravity targets under near simultaneous attack. Parallel attack is very difficult to defend against and can determine the outcome of a war in the first few minutes or hours. It gives a huge advantage to the side that strikes first. The Chinese would almost certainly use parallel attack against the United States with a variety of very capable weapons. In the first Gulf War, which the Chinese have studied in depth, we used a methodology called the 5 rings to determine what should be attacked in Iraq to win the war quickly and realize our objectives. The 5 rings starts in the center with the leadership elements of the opponent. In the second ring from the center are the processes that are essential for a nation to function, processes such as energy provision, communications, and mobility. In the third ring is the fixed infrastructure of the nation, its roads, bridges, railroads, and airfields. In the fourth ring, the population ring, are the different demographic groups of people that compose the nation. And finally, the fifth and outer ring contains the fielded military forces, the forces that attack or defend against another country. And we tend to think that war is the clash of military forces, and it obviously can be. However, if you think about an enemy as a system, as you should, it becomes clear that the most consequential targets are the inner rings of the 5-ring model. Without effective leadership and without essential processes, no nation can survive and fight. Using the Gulf War as a playbook and a variety of kinetic and non-kinetic weapons, the Chinese would conduct strategic parallel attacks on multiple targets to paralyze the United States in hours. We can expect the Chinese to attack American leadership by striking at targets in Washington, ranging from the White House to the Pentagon. In parallel with their attacks on leadership would certainly be attacks on America's essential processes, such as its electricity generation and distribution, its energy production and distribution, its communication systems, its transportation system, and its agricultural system. Many infrastructure targets would also be affected, to include marshalling yards, air traffic control, pipeline control points, major bridges, satellites, and ports. They would undoubtedly also try to influence multiple demographic groups. And finally, they would bring under attack some of our offensive military capability, such as bomber bases, missile silos, and submarine bases. One of the features of parallel attack is that it is not necessary to hit every target. If you hit enough of them in a compressed time frame, you will almost certainly induce strategic paralysis. Thus, a parallel attack on the targets just suggested would mean that our national leadership was crippled and unable to respond, that we would have little or no energy, fuel, or communications available, that there would be no social media, that our air and ground transportation would collapse, that we would have no fuel for cars and trucks, that we would have nationwide food shortages, that our hospitals and fire departments would be overwhelmed, that there would be widespread panic, that our ability to conduct counterattacks would be severely impeded, and that we would be in a state of national strategic paralysis. If we lose, and we will if we are not prepared, we would be impoverished, we would no longer be a great power, we would no longer be able to lead the free world, we would be forced to live under Chinese hegemony, and its authoritative collectivist culture would replace our culture of individual freedom. And we would be forced to kowtow to the Chinese emperor in Beijing. We simply cannot lose a war with China. It would be catastrophic for the United States and for our very way of life. To avoid this catastrophe, we must prepare now for the kind of war that we have never faced. We all hope and pray fervently that it will not take place. If we prepare well and visibly, the chances of it happening may decrease, but we cannot count on the fickle god of deterrence. Remember, peace comes from real strength, not from weakness. The great Duke of Wellington, the man who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, and a man who lived in an era of multiple great powers, once said that a great power can have no such thing as a little war. For many years, the United States has lived in a world where it was the one and only genuinely great power. As a result, it could and did fight little wars with relative impunity. A little war is dramatically different from a big war, and the things that can be done safely in a little war are likely to be fatal in a big war. It is now time that we take Wellington's advice to heart and start preparing for the real war. If we're going to be successful in a big war, we must accept the reality that it will not be like the Serbias, the Libyas, or the Afghanistans that we have known for 2 decades. We must develop a civil military strategy to defeat China. We must have a comprehensive national strategic defense. We must build an offensive, war-winning great power force structure. We must not focus on Taiwan, as important as it may be. Instead, we must focus on the all-out war that we cannot lose. If we can win the big war, Taiwan will be able to survive and prosper. Specifically, we must have a comprehensive strategic defense against air, space, missile, cyber, and biological attack, a veritable dome over the nation. And we must not assume that China will not use nuclear weapons. We must have a rapid global response attack capability that is measured in minutes to hours, not in weeks, months, or years. And finally, we should have a force with multiple revolutionary capabilities and be at least a revolution ahead of all others. Given the challenge, what are our next steps? We must start by developing a comprehensive, aligning national strategy for victory. We must optimize our national security organization for global strategic war with China. We must lay out a program to build a national strategic defense as a #1 priority. We must have a program to develop new offensive capabilities. We must make our infrastructure as robust as possible. As of now, much of our infrastructure is subject to the vagaries of weather. Now we must solve that issue and at the same time make it highly resistant to deliberate attack. We must develop the mobilization programs that will allow us to move almost overnight from a peacetime to a wartime footing. We need education and training programs, not only for the military, but also for the civilian populace and for American businesses. All of the above will require an enormous political effort, which means that all of us must work to convince our political leaders that rapid action is required now. To help in this process, we are developing a series of videos to follow this one that will lay out a game plan that can help the country get to where it needs to go. Go to winningpeerwars.com for more details and notice of new videos. Remember, tempus fugit, time flies. Thus, carpe diem, seize the day. If we seize the day and start smart preparation, we will win, as we must. Failure is simply not an option.